It should turn red in a second. Once it's turned red, we'll be able to get going. Right, yes we are. Okay, right. So I've got a bit of an impromptu stream for us today. Through my conversations online, happened across a person called AK, had a bit of a disagreement of sorts on some political matters. And to save ourselves from going further and round in a cycle of messages to each other, I thought, why not have a conversation more directly? And AK agreed. So AK, nice to speak with you directly. How are you today? All right?
Well, right, it's a bit tired, I didn't sleep much, but that's all right.
It's tricky this time of year, right? I mean, I find the hotter in the UK, at least, the hotter months are a bit trickier to get to sleep in. Our
I mean,
buildings, we don't have the
most,
air conditioning, but the
it's
US,
mostly work stuff.
yeah, no, it's a tricky old time. Everyone's busy. Everyone can find it tricky sometimes. But no, we're going to be having a bit of a discussion today about some of our past, some of our dealings with fascism of the past, the overlying threads of capitalism that existed then and now, and the way America is headed and how it exists today. So, AK, I will let you open the discussion. Where would you like to start with our themes today?
Um, what really is like fascism? Let's just start with that because your description of fascism wasn't really what fascism is. Like, you had elements like what is hyper capitalism, stuff like that, and you kind of
Okay.
got the real nature of capitalism kind of wrong, but stuff like that. Let's just start
Okay.
with that.
Yeah, let's start with fascism then. So, yesterday, for those obviously who weren't in the conversation, I would describe fascism as a system of hyper-capitalism, of extreme nationalism, of authoritarianism, militarism, essentially a system that looks at power structures that exist in the world and intensifies them. That people who wish to be on top of this power structure create a more brutal version of the hierarchy, build it from existing power structures, and use it to increase their oppression and power over those in the bottom, often marginalized, but always in a manner that sees themselves on top. And that's how I would roughly describe fascism. Now, where's your contention with this definition, description?
For starters, capitalism isn't really a like a major pillar of fascism. That's one. Two, I do agree with the authoritarian part. Three, nationalism is more like a conduit, I suppose, to like power and stuff like that. More like just a tool to seize power. Fascism is really complicated because its original definition is not what we see as today. For instance, Mussolini, the guy that came up with fascism, was originally a socialist, and he took some of his ideals with him into fascism. But fascism and its nature is more authoritarian version of that. And there's a lot of history to go into, but you know,
Yeah. Okay. So let's start with one of the threads there. Let's go for the definition part. So capitalism as a system, I think, is also worth sort of trying to define. We can think of it in terms of the free market, in terms of making profits, trying to better yourself upon others. And we're doing this in a sort of abstract way, but we're thinking in terms of taking a product, taking something in society and selling it on for more, and by which you generate capital, generate assets, and use said capital and assets to make more from what was previously had. And when we apply this to the real world, we see it as a wholesale power structure. You own various things in society, and you use them to get more of what is in society, and you do so in competition with fellow capitalists and people in general. Would you say that's accurate to sort of capitalist doctrine or ideology?
to some degree, I think you could label it as a competitive system in order to make a profit.
competition and profitability, and we tend to think of it in terms of economics, right? In terms of
Yes.
the monetary value and such. And I think that in its distilled form, you imagine Adam Smith in the 18th century when he's writing The Wealth of Nations. You can imagine that he is, definitely thinking of it just in terms of markets and stuff. But there's an element of capitalism which is also to do with the social world, to do with our relations to each other, that goes beyond just the market and strictly economic stuff and into power between people. And so when we bring in competition, like you said, we're thinking about how can I be better than my fellow man? How can I have an advantage over others? And because the freedom of the market, is a freedom to pursue this wealth and this capital however we see fit, that competition can be violent and aggressive and naturally leads to the hardships that we're going to discuss in a little bit. You can imagine that the capitalist at the market, to obtain their, let's say they're a farmer, to obtain their land, they've had to perform some act of force onto others. And where we grow from this competition from two farmers to two cities, two countries, naturally entails hierarchies and powers and all manners of violence to maintain. And so this leads us to the fascism that I described a second ago, where despite the fact that on some level we're supposed to have a freedom to pursue money and wealth and how business however we see fit, the capitalists that are actually doing this have accrued so much wealth and so much power that they need extreme forms of this power to maintain it. Now, we'll come on to Nazi Germany in a second and the sort of fascism that we see there, and Mussolini as well. But the structures of capitalism to maintain such wealth over others, to extract profit from people, requires a level of exploitation and violence and force to maintain that then leads into fascism. Fascism in itself is a reaction of this capitalist system, a realization that to maintain their wealth and power, to maintain the markets that they sit on top of, they need to apply more force. And so that's why it's central to a fascist idea of society.
That's not so much true. In fact, I do disagree with a bit of that. Violence is not necessary to keep your wealth. For instance, Elon Musk does not send the army into his factories and shoot up his scientists every once in a while. The way you describe it is not really how to maintain a capitalist system. First, a healthy capitalist system requires regulation. A free
I
market
agree.
is not truly possible without chaos.
Yep.
You need to regulate stuff such as the FDA does, Their job is not always perfect, let's just say. And stuff like that. Like, capitalism does not require force, it simply requires the rule of law to maintain it. I
So
think that's where we really differ is what it required to maintain wealth. Simply, the rule of law is enough. And I do agree that stuff like lobbying and stuff can be used in a negative sense, but usually, like, okay, I don't think Jeff Bezos just wants to, like, how I put it, he really believes that violence is necessary to keep his wealth, or say he doesn't have like fucking guards in his factories to force them into labor. That's more slavery at that point, was what you're talking about, but to
yeah,
some degree.
no, indeed. And I think you're quite right. Yeah. Our system today does need regulation. It's not as though it's 100% just for free market left to its own devices. There is absolutely elements of regulation and planning put into the capitalist economy, and a lot of that is because of left-wing intervention. People who've said, yeah, we need to make things a bit fairer, and some of it is because that's naturally sort of how societies form. There's been people have mediated their markets through existing social organizations like states, kingdoms, nobility, and such, and thus have come to their economics through that. But let's focus on this idea of violence for a second. Violence can be abstracted from the literal sense of someone showing up with a big club and just whacking you. Like, I think because we're lucky, we live in countries that are in the global north, first world. We don't have to interact with violence as much as other people do in the planet. And obviously that's not entirely true for everyone in the country, but on the odds of it are we're not going to have to interact with the elements of society that maintain force. However, to build the wealth of some, you mentioned Elon Musk, to make $1 billion or £1 billion, let alone the billions he does, some force would have had to have been exerted to obtain the stuff that goes into it. So, for instance, the elements you need to make computers, the parts of the car that function to a high degree of technical complexity, even they will require physical extraction from the earth. Now, this takes place often in countries with terrible working conditions. I'm talking proper, like essentially slave mines at the barrel of a gun. And they extract a rare earth metals, which are then sent to factories, often found in Southeast Asia. So China has lots of them, but a lot of nations have special economic zones where capitalists, wealthy corporations from the West can come and put their factories, hire lots of cheap labor, again, often with militia-like security there to make sure it all goes smoothly. This turns the rare metals into the sort of phones and computers and car parts that we take for granted today. They're then shipped over to our countries where, whilst they are there in shops and stuff, they're also heavily guarded. They're also maintained through empires of wealth. The workers who are maintaining this empire, they're working there not so much because they have a choice to, but if they don't accept the conditions that they're offered in those contracts or in other similar working conditions, then they lose access to the privately controlled and distributed necessities of life. If you're not earning a wage at one of these places of work, then good luck accessing food, shelter, electricity, and such. So at every step of the market, there is force that's gone into it, be it through direct physical force in less developed parts of the world, or the force of the market, there's coercive force that says you'll engage in the market in our terms, otherwise you won't access these necessities. And all the while, the people on top of this market who are dictating the terms are the most powerful and wealthy people in the market. They've got the control. You can say no to Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and all the other billionaires, but said billionaires control things you need to survive. So in many ways, we are coerced through the market to act as the market sees fit. Yeah?
There's two things I do have to say to that. Number one, as far as we say about coerced through their control, that is a very complicated thing. For starters, that's a lack of competition. And again, I do want to mention, because I do feel like this is true, that nowadays it seems like the industries are starting to be more solidified, more centralized, and that does lead to more monopolization of power of such like that. But that's one thing. Secondly, when you mentioned the mines and stuff like that, I think that's a good point. I think that's what most people criticisms of stuff like capitalism are. I don't believe that is necessary for capitalism, but I do want to say that we do have to understand the conditions and more like the realities of those say countries, say the Congo, right? The Congo has been in civil war and external war since about, I say, the mid 1990s. There's been many rebellions. There's been many external forces like Rwanda and stuff like that. And that's kind of leading to child labor and forced labor of said militants. And that's a good point. I don't think that's essentially an issue with capitalism. Of course, it's awful and it is a capitalistic system, but I don't believe it's necessary for capitalism. I think that's you have to take into account the conditions and the reality of those said countries.
Yeah.
There's little instability. There's little stability in those countries, and it allows warlords like that to do those awful things and stuff. I don't exactly think it's a necessity for capitalism. I think it's simply a reality of those countries. They're low instability. They're warlords. There's huge power dynamics and stuff like that. And in general, just more of just the reality of the country, so to speak, rather than just the nature of capitalism. And again, as I said, capitalism is in a way a natural selection system. The successful businesses will succeed and the not so ones will fail. And that's kind of how it just works. But I think a healthy system, there is competition. I think there can be some sorts of government regulation or something like that. And perhaps that's leaning a bit into socialism, but I think there is a stable capitalist system, but it needs to be kind of maintained and more,
Mm.
you
I
know,
agree. I think there's definitely there's definitely better versions of the capitalist system we're seeing now that, as you say, would not need the human rights abuse and such what we're seeing in the Congo. But
yeah,
I want to come back to what you said about success because I think this is a sort of a tying point to our sort of fascist discussion that we got in this. So you're absolutely right that they didn't need to turn we don't need to see what happens in the Congo or Southeast Asia or any exploitative place of the capitalist world. We don't need to see that happen. We could have a better system. But the reason it does happen, or a massive driving force of why it does happen, is the capitalist motive of profit and capital accumulation and maintaining better position over your competitors. So the companies that engage in these unethical practices aren't necessarily doing it because they're inherently evil, but because someone somewhere in that organization has said we can accumulate a greater degree of revenue than corporation XYZ if we cut a corner here. And that also explains why other unethical practices like cutting environmental regulations or not paying workers properly, according to their labor. They're not doing it because they're some cartoon villain. They're doing it because it's been justified through the market. And when we turn this same logical idea into fascism, onto the fascist discussion, the capitalists who have decided to abandon civil liberties and have decided to put their weight behind people who support open state mandated violence are doing so because it allows them a greater chance of becoming the most successful business, becoming the dominant power. And if that means bulldozing other businesses and bulldozing people for essentially just who they are, then so be it. And I think this almost leads us a bit naturally into the history of Nazi Germany, which we can discuss now if you'd like.
that is an interesting um, transition, I must admit. But uh, I'm trying to take that on what you said. So, as far as what you said, yes, we can't deny that human greed or corruption will happen in any system, no matter what it is. People will always try to look out for themselves and look out for the better of themselves. And there's, let's be honest, there's, you can probably say trillions of examples of this, truly uncountable examples, but I think that's really a problem. At first, is in every single system. We cannot deny that every system will have to deal with the effects of human greed, incompetence, and selfishness. I think that's a problem that every system will have to deal with. Communism, capitalism, democracy, anything really. Um, that is a good point though. And I think that's really why I do stress the regulation part, like blood diamonds, for example. we've all heard of them. We've all known about them, the crimes and stuff like that. Now there have been efforts, and I think even though there's small efforts, they have been made, and they have been successful in like whittling down the blood diamonds, but they're not totally extinct. There probably won't be, but they are. There can be efforts made to maybe not fully crush it, but at the very least minimize it. But anyway, into where you're getting to, what did you want to discuss about Nazi Germany?
Okay. Um, so I think actually it ties into what you've just said there as well, to be honest. Um, when we think about why things happen in society, um, under a capitalist system, the market can explain quite a lot of it. And that's not to say that we're 100% just driven by money and we're just like automatons that are just going to look at a number and such. But this mode of thinking is encouraged by a capitalist system that does work on markets, but does say if you have more capital, then you are the most successful capitalist. And so when we find ourselves in 1920s and 1930s Germany, we've just had World War One. We're about to see the biggest economic crash of history. Basically, the Great Depression is about to happen, and you can imagine the capitalists who are in Germany are feeling pretty worried. Not only have they got this economic crisis going on, they're losing control of the economy. Their money is essentially becoming more and more worthless. They're also seeing mass worker discontent. People in Russia have already overthrown their preceding Tsarist system, but there's worker movements springing up all across the continent. And so they're thinking, wow, we've got to put something in to protect our resources and our wealth. And at the same sort of time as this discontent is going on, you've got the Nazis, you've got the homegrown nationalism and anti everything basically, but the discontent from the end of World War One, where the German Empire was defeated, that discontent merging with other existing bigotries. So anti-Semitism obviously has a massive history in Europe. It's been around for centuries in Europe, but this was part of this fascist movement. You've got the frustration at a lack of national power for Germans. And so this then weds with a capitalist class that wish to protect their wealth and their resources from the potential of worker discontent. Also, at the same time as the rising fascism in Germany was a rising socialist party, communist party. There was lots of competing ideologies in Nazi Germany. The Nazis, though, were a far-right party. They wedded themselves to capital, to the wealthy capitalists. And sure, plenty of businesses that were not approved Nazi ideology. So if you were a Jewish business, then obviously that was targeted. If you were a business that had connections to various disapproved peoples, then of course that was going to not be permitted. But a massive driving force of the Nazi movement was capitalism. And we can see this because when the Nazis did take over, many of their policies were as though written by the capitalists themselves. So the privatization of previously state sectors and industries, the handing of resources to private control, the handing of essentially societal power from what was previously state stuff to the private sector. And so this demonstrates quite effectively that capitalists will happily embrace fascism if the conditions are right, if society permits them to, and if it makes them greater profit.
Well, I think there's some other things to consider. First, you talk about the economic conditions. Now, historically, we all know that poverty has a terrible effect on society. Crime goes up. It's just anything bad comes with poverty. But I think an economic crisis like that, and I think this is true almost for every single economic crisis, that breeds extremism and radicalization. So I think that's one thing to consider. I think you made a point two things I want to mention. For starters, you can't really blame someone like a company like that getting swept up in a movement like Nazism. When you have a popular, powerful party that's kind of rising to power, you want to side with the people that are winning. That's just natural. You want to align with a winning side. We can all say, you got morals and shit like that, but let's be honest, most people in Germany probably were like not actual Nazis, but kind of got swept up in the movement. Not everyone agreed with it, but everyone had to kind of go along with it eventually. I'm trying to just like take everything you said and just like kind of,
I'll try and make my points a bit shorter next time, eh?
huh? Yeah, because
I'll try and get my sentences down if it's getting a
yeah, I
bit long.
know, I know. Um, one thing I do want to say is that the Nazis did take over certain industries, like they would take over the steel industry, most of the industries they needed for war and stuff like that. That's more of a wartime thing, but the way they kind of operated was more banditry rather than true um capitalism. You see that in a lot of things like free, like what was it? Was there plans like free space or something like that? When they're moving into Russia, they're just gonna take up all that land and like kind of move people in and resources and stuff like that. It's more the way they ran their economy was not efficient at all. If I'm being honest, it was more towards like their goals, the desires to take over stuff. So the way they ran their economy wasn't really capitalistic. It was more,
Fascist,
it-
right?
yeah, it was more just take what they need or take what they want, kind of way they ran it. And there's like
Mm.
multiple examples. There was I don't I I mentioned it, but I probably got what's called wrong, just because I'm just going off the top of my head here, just what I remember. But free living space, all that kind of stuff. When they're moving into the Soviet
Yes,
Union,
yeah, yeah. They claimed that the natural land of the German populace was greater than what they had previously, right?
yes,
Hence their
yes,
expansion. Um, but yeah, no, I get complete what you're saying, right? They were bandits. They were, turns out not actually that good at running an economy. Um, they didn't believe in coherent and sensible ideas. But what they also did, through their ideas, was promote the business and capitalist cause, through it. The state absolutely did take over industry, and they absolutely did. The Nazis did 100% exert control from within, but that control was still in aid of permitted capitalists, right? Like the people who were given the contracts to operate various sectors of the industry were massive corporations, many of which, well, obviously not Nazi today, are still, you can draw a straight line from their current iterations to their operations in Nazi Germany. And that's because the through line is capitalism. They made their money, they made a greater profit than they would have done if they didn't have fascist stuff going on. And they were able to keep the profits they made. The idea that this, because the Nazis were controlling, it's not a true sort of capitalist sense, I think is and isn't true, because you're quite right. Like on the surface of it, the idea that a state like Nazi Germany could have anything to do with opening up a business today and trying to compete with, like, I feel like we imagine capitalism to be like three different business owners trying different techniques to get their product out. One person tries a big advertising campaign, one person thinks they can be really efficient and cut costs, a person thinks a different technique. Like we can imagine like different economic competing models from people like on a small level. But going back to what you said at the start, it's at core that power structure. How can I be more powerful than my neighbor? How can I make more profit and have more wealth than my neighbor? And so the Nazis' campaigns of land conquering and killing off a competition and imprisoning workers that didn't submit to the conditions they said, all aid in that goal. And I think that's the sort of extra steps we're taking here to understand the link. And I'll respond to the other stuff in a second. I'll let you come and respond to that stuff so that we can keep going on what we're saying.
I think some of the stuff you said was more just authoritarianism in general. But I do also want to say that we have to look at the Nazi beliefs and what they were kind of rival to. The major party that they were against before they took power was the Communist Party. And one of the major things, the atmosphere at the time, people didn't really like communism. People somewhat feared it. And that's what the Nazis really took in. For starters, that's because it's mostly their rivals. And secondly, that's kind of the boogeyman. You see that in America too, to some degree, the communist boogeyman. And that's kind of what the Nazis kind of wanted. They wanted that communist boogeyman. And that's why they kind of leaned into stuff like that and anti-communist stuff. I think that's
Yeah,
one
Red
thing to
Scare.
consider when we're talking about what they supported and stuff like that. Their
Yeah,
goals were more selfish, like most politicians. Their goals were naturally selfish and simply idealistic to gain a following. They don't actually do what they promise, stuff like that.
yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely you're 100% right. Like Red Scare was as present then as it was in America. They 100% were a party set up in response to, the fear of communism, and they openly fought and imprisoned. They had the communists struck off the ballot to get elected. They banned after Reichstag fire. They said, right, you imprison all the senior members of the party, and you're not going to stand in the election either, which is partly how Hitler won his election. But I think the step we also have to acknowledge there is that the fear of a far left movement like communism is that it is anti-capitalist. It says we want to distribute resources based on a different measure than just the free market. And capitalists who are funding the Nazi Party will not like that, because that would say, well, these resources that you've had privately stashed under your corporate control is now the responsibility of everyone in Germany to manage and distribute according to everyone's need. And so that also then brings us on to the poverty breeding radicalization. Yeah, again, another thing that I agree with, people in desperate times, with the economy falling apart around them and lots of uncertainty, are more likely to be radicalized into the far right. But equally, there were a lot of people who saw this poverty as the response, the cause of the capitalist system. The idea that you can just endlessly accumulate profit was criticized by a lot of people. Hence the growing of far left parties in Germany, and simultaneously, hence the backlash and anger from the far right. And so all of the things that we sort of said linked to this fear and anger and want for more from the capitalist presence in Germany, wedding with Nazism, an extreme movement funded by the capitalists, to turn Nazi Germany in order to protect resources in Germany and then make more profit, to make more from it.
I think that could be said about a lot of movements when we really think about it.
Yeah, probably could.
I mean, let's be honest. We could say that about tons of ideologies and stuff like that. People would take the side that benefits them. Communism obviously does not benefit a capitalist person. It's really the opposite of what they want. So of course they're going to take up with the other side, not out of actual like belief in that side, but
Yeah.
because that simply because survival and stuff like that. And that kind of does go into the bad things about communism, but I think that's a topic for another time.
Yeah, but then that bad stuff with like the capitalists could have it's not as though it was just the communists and just the Nazis. The capitalists could have stuck with the sort of liberal parties, the centre parties. They could have gone to just like a conservative party, but these parties, whilst there and still in opposition to the communists, weren't perceived as strong enough by the capitalists to effectively protect them. Essentially, they could see that the swelling of the tide, the momentum was with the far left, and so they wanted the far right to step in to protect them from potential redistribution of resources. So, because like you said earlier, right, like not everyone in Germany was a full-blown die-on-the-wall SS member ready to die for Hitler. Like lots of Germans were, obviously not like in communism, a lot of them, but also just sort of, regular everyday people. They didn't necessarily need to go in line with the Nazis, but they did because the logic of capitalism: how we're going to make the most money, how are we going to protect our capital? Let's go with the far right party that have promised to imprison all the dissidents and also deregulate and privatize the economy to hand us over these resources. And I think that is a central part of it. Fascism, as well as being like the principles of capitalism, takes the existing moral structures and throws them out the window. For as much as a lot of people in Nazi Germany were not full-blown Nazis, there are millions of Germans who actively resisted and died to try and stop Nazism from happening, and did so through the war as well. Like, I often find it frustrating that people say, "Oh, the Germans did this," because Germany was, it's a country of many different people. The Nazis
Right.
and Nazi, people who essentially allowed the process of Nazism to come into place, be it conservatives and liberals in government or business owners that were happy looking the other way at Nazi policy if it meant their business got to stay open. Like, they should be the ones we focus on.
I do want to mention this thing
Yeah.
that's from the capitalist point of view, that's like a survival thing when you think about either this side wins or the communists win. Now we have to take into effect the Russians, right? One thing that caused the Red Scare and stuff like that was just how violent and bloody the Russian Revolution is and the Civil War and stuff like that. We all like at the time that was a very scary thing, and that's what kind of drove a lot of people away from it because it was violent, it was bloody, and it really made people scared of it. And like the things they were doing, the gulags, if you know it about the gulags,
Yeah.
The successful people that if you're like somewhat doing better than someone else, they like round you up and throw you in a gulag and stuff like that. And stuff like that made the fear of communism valid to many people at the time. I think we had to take that into account too. Again, that kind of just goes with all the things we've been saying, the
Yeah.
fear, the atmosphere, all that. We have to take into account that if one side that I fear that's going to like kill me or stuff like that, simply the survival thing to do is choose the other side. And I don't really think you can blame someone for simply trying to get out with your life or with the money you've worked for your whole life, stuff like that. So I think there's a level to of understanding you can give to them. Now it's
We
to people that
can we can understand why, like that. If someone, if we were in a time machine and we went to just after World War II, and you spoke to someone in newly freed Germany, and they said, "Yeah, I had to go along with it. I had to survive. Look at what Russia was doing." Like, you could understand what had produced that, but at the same time, I don't think that is an acceptable. Like, it doesn't wash really for me, because a lot of like the Nazis were very open in what they intended to do. Like, their violence and their hatred was a core part of their movement. And like, let's say the Nazis don't exist for whatever reason, the conservatives and liberals could just as easily said, "Yeah, we're going to deregulate everything, and the private sector is going to save us again, and we're going to go back to good old-fashioned capitalist values," and not done the genocide and mass imprisonment and death. Like, the reason that we're so critical of Nazi Germany in part is because the atrocities that happened were above and beyond so much of what had come before it. I think
yeah.
thinking about, I mean, we've already said we're going to perhaps discuss Soviet Russia another time, but just touching on it briefly, the fear of like Russia and what happened in Russia as such is part of obviously the many factors went into why the initial goals of revolutionaries, became distorted and were fully able to be realized and such. And there's a long history to discuss. But part of fascism is that nationalist fear and that frenzy and that cultural element. You can imagine there's a lot of anti-Russian sentiment in Europe anyway, because you look at a core part of the Nazi ideology, as well as all the other discrimination, was also anti-Eastern European. The Slavic populations were described in disgusting ways by Nazi ideology. And when World War II happens and the expansion from Germany moves eastwards, there's terrible crimes committed all across the Eastern Europe, and so that in itself not only is part of why the as you said, fascism is more than just extreme capitalism. It is all those things together, but the brutality that was seen was also designed to promote capitalist ideas for the people that are beneficiaries. So if you're not the Untermensch that Hitler's later, if you're not someone who is Eastern European or Jewish or black or gay or whatever, then you now have all this free enterprise that we've stolen from various peoples to make it happen. And so whilst of course there were absolutely people who had to stay quiet and felt they were completely oppressed and couldn't do anything and such, there were also lots of people in Nazi Germany who looked at this right-wing vision of society, as we've just said, the fear of Russia being one of the things, but all the other things as well. They looked at what the Nazis were saying and they said, yeah, we're happy to not only turn a blind eye, but we're happy to engage in a Nazi economy because we've now got more capital. And I think that's part of why this right-wing link can't be forgotten, because ultimately when we give in to increasing versions of capitalist profit and capital accumulation and endless, ceaseless, free pursuit of power and wealth, it can lead to atrocity, like the fascism we're seeing then.
So my brother's vacuuming, so it might be a little loud. But yeah, I do think there's a lot to consider. There's a lot of things that really go into the mess that was Nazism. I don't
Yeah.
think many people were exactly promoted by like capitalistic principle, more like oh shit. Like you talk about the atrocities, right? The Slavic thing, for example, was certainly true. Hitler was famously anti-Slavic. There was plenty of that before, and I don't think that's more like prejudice, and racism is really the term because they're, let's be honest, a Russian person's white and a German person's white. I think it's more that element is more prejudice and stuff like that, and more hatred.
Like xenophobia and stuff.
Yes,
Still
stuff
part
like
of the same
that, stuff
package,
like
but
that. I think it's more that part. I suppose like the whole we take their stuff, it's now our stuff. You could take that angle, but I don't think that's like a core element per se. It is a major thing, of course. Again, living space and stuff like that. But I don't really take in like the capitalist element was exactly like a major element. I think it was certainly there to some degree, but it wasn't a major one at the very least. And I think we should talk about Soviet Russia sometime because that's another element that needs to be taken when we're talking about
no,
capitalism
definitely.
and
Like I
stuff like
think,
that.
yeah, like it's again. I think if you asked like if we had this time machine, if you asked Hitler directly, like sure he might not express it in the exact way that I have here, but what we're doing almost is abstracting and reading between the lines almost and recognizing that many of the same tenets are there as the driving force. And some of it is direct because, like, even if we're going back to those atrocities, many corporations made fortunes from the Holocaust, be it through the slave labor, the labor they had in the concentration camps, which built many of the things that the German war effort needed, or through active theft. Look at all the the wealth stolen from victims of a Holocaust that was just taken literally. You evict Jewish families and businesses and stuff, and then you've now got all the stuff that you've left behind for yourself. And that violence, whilst not, you're not going to find that in a Wealth of Nations or in some capitalist doctrine, but that is capital accumulation just through extreme means. And that's what fascism is. And that's why I think it's so important to be able to connect the two, because where we linking it to today, I suppose, where we see a society drifting further and further right and sticking to this, I want the world and we need to make ourselves the best and stuff. The further we go into that, the more likely it is that the atrocities of the past repeat themselves. That's the danger.
I do agree with that last part, certainly. Although I do want to mention when you say you talk about the slave labor and all that, I think it equally apply to a communist state when you think about the Soviet Union and China. They had their own camps, different, not the bigoted kind, but they did have that exploitation. They did take people's stuff. I think, to me, one thing I really feel like that is similar to communism, capitalism is it's just different people taking it. Like it's the government taking it rather than the monopoly man, if you know what I mean. I think
Yeah. I mean,
communism. One of the things about communism is just you're just replacing who takes your shit. If you really want to think it like the slavery way or the whatever way, it's just like a different people taking it. And it's a person with an army instead of just I don't know a dollar bill, if you know what I mean. I think that's something to take into consideration.
yeah, I mean, like we said, we're going to have to do a full one of a proper talk on Soviet Russia in the future. But to briefly offer my thought on that, I think the core difference is that the vision of communism that the revolutionaries and people in those countries will have had is different to that which the state apparatus and various parties like Stalin and such who took
That I do
over
agree with.
implemented. Like the people who wanted the Tsar and his family to give up their wealth and lands and end the suffering in Russia weren't the same ones who had the state mandated control of various industries and committed all the atrocities and such. But we'll have to continue that one in
I
a
think
separate stream perhaps at some point.
that's a different topic, but I do think theoretically, theoretically, like it does sound good. I do understand people for like taking it theoretically, but I just believe that when you try to put it in practice, it just ends up becoming a different form of exploitation. If you really want to see capitalism from the exploitation point of view, I think ideally it sounds good on paper, but putting it to practice, I think just how people are, it eventually becomes what it kind of hates is something I feel about communism. But again, as you've been saying multiple times, that's a topic for a different video.
Well, indeed. If we do a part two, perhaps we'll come on to that one. But I suppose our thread, with our Nazi Germany, sort of discussed a little bit. The nadir of human history, perhaps. One of the certainly the most notorious war, genocide. Like it is a moment in history that I think is hard to shake as like the biggest point in history of human atrocity. And you'd never want to like try and be some let's rank humans' worst moments, but it does stand out as a turning point in human history, and that's partly why I think it's so important to be able to see the similarities between Nazi Germany then and the world then, and the fascism we're seeing today. Now I'll let you go first on where you stand on current happenings in America with Trump and such, but.
For starters, I want to say that the 1920s to the 40s is certainly something to study, something to understand, because that was a time when stuff like communism and fascism and all that stuff were coming into being, really when they were getting their feet in the door. And it was a very extreme time. There was a lot of things happening. There was depression. There was all that stuff. I think that is like a time to study when it comes to the extremities of ideology. When an ideology truly becomes radical and stuff like that, I think that is a good time to study, but there's a whole lot of differences from now and then.
No, definitely. I mean, I think that's the trickiness of trying to study like fascism and such, and any system really, is that not only do we live in the conditions around us, making it harder to separate ourselves from it, there's also the element of knowing what is different and what's the same, and being able to remove the context of things and apply it to new situations.
Yeah,
Because we've got Nazi Germany, so like that when you think of fascism, you think of Nazi Germany, you think of Hitler, and so if things don't perfectly align, or if we find some difference, then we're reluctant almost to make the comparison, because who wants to be perceived as being hyperbolic? Who wants to be a person that says we're in the worst time than everyone? Like it's like, I think as well, because so much media since World War II has made fun of the Nazis and sort of used Hitler as a punchline, and fascist like as an insult is sort of divorced from exactly what it originally was. It takes away some of the power. Like obviously, if you saw like a swastika, that is still like, wow, that's like something that's really shocking and stark. But because Nazi Germany was not in my lifetime, not in your lifetime,
yeah,
most people, like the majority of people alive today, did not experience World War II directly, and those who did, many of them won't be old enough to remember it, let alone have fought in it. Like it's lost that same visceral connection. So when we see in America today a democratically elected, I put in quotation marks just because I wouldn't say America's democracy is entirely the best, but Trump won the election. He's putting in all these authoritarian measures. You've got National Guard being deployed over the last few days. You've got crackdowns on marginalized populations, the mass deregulation of various business practices, the selling off of state. Oh, hello. Oh, I think AK has gone. Perhaps maybe hopefully his internet hasn't gone completely. But yeah, no, the essentially I'm just saying that there's a lot of similarities between Trump's America and Nazi Germany, and that the tools that the things that fascism needs are all there. Hopefully AK hasn't gone completely. Fingers crossed. Perhaps I'll join again in a second. But no, whilst we wait for AK, we can think about all the similarities, even the fact that Trump's just actively, played the big charismatic authoritarian type for years now, even before his his active presidential run. Like just the idea that this sort of ideologue billionaire can be this big powerhouse in society is ultimately one that is of the same fascistic iconography as the supreme leader, the unquestionable, the Führer. Now, because again, we imagine Hitler and we think of him as such a figure, an awful person uniquely, that it's hard to put anyone alongside him. It sounds hyperbolic saying, yeah, Nazi Germany is analogous to America today, but it's where we are. It's the timeline we're in. If we don't act to stop this and to fight against this, then where are we going to end up? We're going to end up in the worst timeline, where the worst of the past repeats itself. And you might argue, depending on who you are in American society and the world, that the worst has happened. Who is someone of an undocumented family that has been persecuted by ICE, or even a documented one, because ICE don't really particularly care. Like, there's no, if you aren't deemed American enough because of your skin tone or your potential nationality, in your family, then you're someone in the crosshairs of a basically paramilitary organization, ICE, and the awful tactics. I'm going to give AK a message quickly. And we'll see what is happening. Because I'm quite concerned, slightly concerned that things aren't quite there. Whilst you wait, I will share very briefly some of the stuff we can have a look at. How do I share my screen? Here we go. So this is quite an interesting read, but essentially this paper looks at the privatization of society in 1930s Germany, and tons of stuff was binned off. Like it is quite profound how much stuff they flogged off to corporations, and we know this because if we have a look down this list, which I can share next when my tab decides to work. Now, it's only a Wikipedia page. Obviously, there's lots of links and sources and stuff within this list, but there's tons of corporations here, and a lot of them are ones you might recognize today. Allianz, quite a big one. Audi, BMW. There's loads of Deutsche Bank, Dr. Oetker. And that's not to say that all these corporations now are active Nazi fronts, but to say that capitalists, as we were saying earlier, they've reacted to the conditions of the time, be it through direct participation in atrocity or through benefiting from the business created for them by Nazi Germany. Ultimately, capitalism benefits from this force, benefits from this violent society. And unfortunately, that means that in today's awful times, whilst there is some natural moral revulsion at what's going on, if you're a military contractor, if you're running a private prison, if you're doing anything really that involves some engagement with the new conditions that Trump's America is trying to put into the world, you are going to be in better stead. You're going to have some business opportunities, because if you're one of the selected capitalists, you're going to be there. Right, hopefully there's a message. So AK says his internet hasn't gone, which is curious. I hope we try and work out what's happening with this, because it's a little bit curious, isn't it, that it would just drop in the middle of the call. Apologies to people watching this on repeat. Hopefully, AK will be back shortly. He's typing now. But yeah, I'll link some of this stuff in the chat about Nazi Germany and their right-wing policies, because it is important stuff to consider. If we've got to learn from history, we've got to learn from all the stuff that's there. I'll try resending him the link. Hopefully, he should be able to get back in. Riveting viewing. I'll put a time code in the description and such to skip past this part if you're watching it on repeats even. But if not, then the America part will have to be wrapped into part 2, I guess, when we discuss this. Backstage. Huh. That is really strange. I don't know why that's doing it like that. So AK currently reckons that I'm not in the studio. Add myself back in. Tell you what, this is very bizarre. You do wonder what goes on with some of this stuff. Right, so currently AK reckons that the stream does not have me in it. Now, I'm looking at YouTube at the moment. I'm definitely on screen. I'm definitely visible. Just have to hope that it's not completely, blown up, whatever's going on. How frustrating, eh? Modern technology not working properly. Right, as we're getting to the American part as well. The stuff happening today. No, AK reckons he's locked out. Right. In that case, then, we'll have to do part 2 another time. AK, if you're listening, thanks again. We'll definitely do America and then the Soviet Union repass another time. Hopefully, we've all been able to enjoy a bit of this. Fascism is a thing that happened. It's far right. It's capitalist. Got to fight those things to prevent fascism from being realized in the future. Thanks, everyone, for listening.